Think about what happens when an avoidant stops seeing you as an option and starts experiencing you as someone who has a permanent place in their internal world. And here's where people get confused. They look at behavior and assume behavior tells the entire story. They pulled away, so they must not care. They became distant, so I must not matter. They stopped communicating, so the connection must be over. But human psychology is rarely that simple. An avoidant can create distance precisely because the relationship has become emotionally significant. That doesn't mean every withdrawal is secretly love. We have to be intellectually honest about that. Distance can mean disinterest, incompatibility, or a desire to move on. But when an avoidant has genuine attachment, something different can happen internally. The more important you become, the more their protective instincts may activate. Why? Because intimacy creates exposure. An avoidant often values autonomy because autonomy feels safe. If nobody gets too close, nobody gets enough access to hurt them, disappoint them, control them, or demand something emotionally difficult from them. Independence becomes more than a preference. It becomes a psychological defense. So when someone enters their life and begins to matter deeply, the very connection they desire can also trigger the fear they have spent years learning to manage. And suddenly, you're not just another person. You're a psychological reference point. They begin measuring experiences against you. They notice when something reminds them of you. They remember conversations they once dismissed. They may wonder what you're thinking, whether you've moved on, or whether the connection is still available. Outwardly, they may maintain composure. Internally, however, the relationship can occupy far more space than their behavior suggests. This is where you need to understand something powerful. Being emotionally significant to someone does not automatically mean they know how to handle that significance. A person can value you and still fear intimacy. They can miss you and still avoid contacting you. They can recognize your importance and still struggle to communicate it. That's the contradiction that makes avoidant dynamics so confusing. But don't make the mistake of turning that contradiction into an excuse for poor treatment. Your job isn't to decode every withdrawal and convince yourself that every act of distance means hidden devotion. Your job is to observe reality while maintaining your own standards. If someone values you but repeatedly refuses to meet you with honesty, consistency, and respect, their internal feelings cannot substitute for healthy behavior. Because ultimately, relationships aren't built on what someone secretly feels. They're built on what two people are willing to consciously create. And that is where your power comes in. The moment you stop obsessively asking, how do I make them choose me? And start asking, what kind of relationship am I willing to participate in? Your entire psychological position changes. You stop chasing evidence. You stop interpreting silence as a challenge. You stop performing for someone's approval. You become grounded. And ironically, that is often when an avoidant recognizes the difference between someone who was simply available and someone who genuinely mattered. Because when you stop making yourself endlessly available, they are forced to confront reality. You were never an option waiting on the shelf. You were a person with your own direction, standards, and freedom. And that realization can be profound. The quietest shift may be the most powerful one, when they stop seeing you as someone they could lose and start realizing you are someone they already lost the moment they refuse to value you. And once you understand that first shift, you begin to notice something even quieter. The avoidant may not tell you that you matter more than before. They may not suddenly become emotionally expressive. They may not make some dramatic declaration. Instead, you may begin appearing in places where you were never consciously invited before, in their imagination of the future. This is psychologically significant because the future is where people reveal what they are beginning to emotionally organize around. An avoidant often protects independence by keeping life compartmentalized. Today is today. Their plans belong to them. Their routines belong to them. Their emotional world stays under control. But when someone becomes deeply significant, that separation can begin to weaken. They start imagining situations and almost unconsciously, you are there. They think about taking a trip and wonder how you would experience it. They imagine a difficult season in their life and picture what it would be like to have you beside them. They consider a change in career, a new home, a family event, or some distant possibility, and your presence quietly enters the picture. They may never tell you, but internally, something has changed. You have moved from being part of their present experience to becoming part of their mental projection of tomorrow. And understand what that means. We don't repeatedly place people into our imagined future unless our mind has assigned them significance. The human brain is constantly predicting, organizing, and preparing. We construct possible futures based on what we value, what we fear, and what we believe may remain important. So when an avoidant repeatedly imagines you in those possibilities, they are confronting something that contradicts their usual emotional strategy: permanence. Because permanence requires vulnerability. It's easy to enjoy someone's presence while maintaining the belief that you can leave at any moment. It's much harder to imagine your life without someone after you have unconsciously started building them into your future. That's where the internal conflict becomes powerful. Part of them may say, I need my freedom. Another part quietly asks, what if this person is supposed to be part of my life? One voice wants distance. Another has already begun creating attachment. And this is why their behavior can sometimes seem contradictory. They may pull back today while mentally imagining you months from now. They may avoid defining the relationship while privately wondering what a long-term version of it would look like. They may insist they don't want expectations while becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the possibility that you could disappear completely. But again, don't confuse internal projection with commitment. Imagining you in their future is not the same as building a future with you. That distinction matters. You should never settle for potential when you need reality. You should never build an entire emotional life around what someone might eventually become. Your standards must remain connected to observable behavior. What matters is that their internal world may be moving faster than their external behavior. And when that happens, pressure begins to build. The person who once felt completely comfortable keeping you at a distance may suddenly realize that distance has consequences. Because now the question isn't simply, do I want this person? The deeper question becomes, what happens if this person isn't here anymore? And that question changes everything. When you become part of someone's imagined future, losing you is no longer an abstract possibility. It becomes the removal of a future they had quietly begun constructing. And sometimes the most powerful realization isn't that someone finally says, I want you. It's that they privately realize, I was already imagining tomorrow with you in it. And once someone has quietly begun placing you in their imagined future, something else starts to happen. Your absence begins to communicate what your presence once concealed. When you were always there, your availability could become psychologically predictable. They knew they could step back and still find you nearby. They knew they could disappear into their own world and return when they felt comfortable. And because there was no immediate consequence to that distance, they didn't necessarily have to confront what your presence actually meant to them. But then something changes. You stop filling every silence. You stop initiating every conversation. You stop explaining yourself. You stop trying to repair every moment of emotional distance. And suddenly, your absence creates a space their mind has to process. This is where people often misunderstand avoidant psychology. They assume that because an avoidant doesn't immediately chase, they must not care. But emotional processing doesn't always produce immediate action. Someone can experience longing, uncertainty, regret, or fear, while simultaneously retreating because their defensive system tells them to regain control. That's why absence can be psychologically louder than presence. Your presence gives someone information. Your absence creates questions. Why aren't they reaching out? Have they moved on? Are they still thinking about me? Did I push them too far? Questions create mental attention, and attention reinforces emotional significance. But there's an important distinction here. Your goal is not to disappear as a manipulation strategy. You are not creating silence to punish someone or manufacture jealousy. That's still attachment to their reaction. Real strength comes from stepping back because you have decided that your life cannot revolve around someone else's uncertainty. You reclaim your attention. You return to your goals. You invest in your friendships, your work, your growth, your peace. And when you do that, something profound happens internally. Not necessarily in them, but in you. You stop measuring your worth by their responsiveness. That is freedom. And ironically, freedom is often what makes your absence so noticeable. Because when someone realizes that your life continues without their participation, they are confronted with a reality they may have avoided. You were never permanently available to them. They may remember the small things you used to do. They may revisit conversations. They may notice how different the day feels without your messages. They may suddenly recognize how much emotional space you occupied simply because you were consistently present. And this is where absence becomes a mirror. It doesn't create feelings that never existed. It reveals what was already there. If there was genuine attachment, your absence may bring that attachment into sharper awareness. If there was no meaningful connection, distance may simply confirm that reality. Either way, you gain information. And that's why you should never fear stepping back from someone who isn't meeting you halfway. You are not losing your power by becoming less available to inconsistency. You are discovering it. Because the deepest form of confidence is not saying, I know you'll come back. It's saying, whether you come back or not, I will not abandon myself. That is the shift from chasing to choosing. And when an avoidant realizes that your absence isn't a tactic, that you have genuinely returned your energy to your own life, the emotional equation changes. They can no longer rely on your constant availability to avoid confronting what you mean to them. Suddenly, your absence becomes information. And sometimes the quietest message you can send is the one that requires no words at all. You don't have to choose me, but I will always choose myself. And once your absence begins to make them aware of what your presence actually meant, another subtle shift can emerge. They begin to notice your freedom. They notice that you have a life outside of them. They notice that other people value you. They notice that your attention is not an unlimited resource. And suddenly the possibility of someone else having access to the person they once assumed would remain emotionally available becomes real. Now, let's be careful here. We're not talking about manipulation, jealousy games, or trying to make an avoidant insecure. That's not emotional strength. That's emotional strategy. And strategy built around another person's reaction still leaves you psychologically dependent on them. What we're talking about is something deeper. The moment an avoidant realizes that you are an autonomous human being with the freedom to choose where your love, attention, time, and energy go. That realization can be confronting. Why? Because distance feels very different when you believe someone is still waiting for you. If you assume someone will always be there, you can postpone decisions. You can remain uncertain. You can tell yourself, I'll figure it out later. But when you realize that person has options, your uncertainty suddenly has consequences. And that is where psychological significance begins to intensify. They may notice that you're no longer asking for their attention. They may see that you're building your own life. They may hear that you're doing well. They may observe that you aren't collapsing because they withdrew. And somewhere inside, a question emerges. What if they choose someone else? That question can reveal attachment because it introduces scarcity. Not artificial scarcity, but the reality that human relationships are voluntary. Nobody belongs to anybody. You cannot claim a person simply because you develop feelings for them. You cannot expect someone to remain emotionally available while you continually refuse to participate. Love does not create ownership. And that's exactly why this realization can be so powerful for an avoidant. They may have unconsciously believed that emotional distance protected them from vulnerability. They could maintain independence while still having access to the connection. But once you become genuinely independent of their approval, the arrangement changes. Now they have to confront a difficult truth. Independence works both ways. They are free to step back. You are free to walk forward. And psychologically, that symmetry can be profound. Because sometimes the avoidant doesn't fully appreciate the value of a relationship until they recognize that the relationship is not guaranteed. Not because you manipulated them into fear, but because human beings often understand value more clearly when permanence is no longer assumed. Think about it. When something feels endlessly available, the mind can categorize it as stable background. But when access becomes uncertain, attention increases. The brain starts asking questions. Memory becomes more active. Possibilities become more vivid. They may begin remembering the moments when you made them feel understood. They may notice the difference between your presence and the attention they receive from other people. They may become curious about who you're spending time with. They may wonder whether someone else is now receiving the emotional closeness they once had access to. But again, your mission is not to provoke those thoughts. Your mission is to become unavailable to relationships that require you to shrink yourself. That's the philosophical distinction. If you become independent merely to make someone chase you, you're still controlled by their response. But if you become independent because you finally understand your own worth, then something changes at the deepest level. You no longer ask, How can I make them afraid of losing me? You ask, why would I remain where I am not consistently valued? That's a much stronger question. And that question changes your posture, your decisions, your boundaries, and eventually your entire emotional life. Because when you genuinely understand your worth, you don't need to compete with anyone for someone's attention. You don't need to manufacture jealousy. You don't need to prove that you're desirable. You simply live. You grow. You become more fully yourself. And if the avoidant is emotionally attached, they may eventually confront the reality that the person they thought they could keep at a comfortable distance has a life that does not revolve around them. That realization can be uncomfortable. But discomfort is not always a problem. Sometimes discomfort is the beginning of awareness. Sometimes the fear of losing access to someone forces a person to finally recognize how much they had taken for granted. And sometimes your greatest power is not making someone afraid to lose you. It is becoming so secure in yourself that you no longer need them to fear losing you at all. You don't prove your value by being impossible to replace. You prove it by refusing to abandon yourself for someone who won't choose you. And once an avoidant begins recognizing that you are not permanently available, another quiet sign can reveal itself. They start remembering the details, not the obvious details, the little ones. The way you took your coffee, the phrase you always used when something bothered you, the song you played repeatedly, the expression on your face when you were trying not to laugh, the story you told them once that they seemed to forget, the particular way you reacted when you felt appreciated, or the way your voice changed when you were disappointed. You may think, if they remember all of that, why didn't they show me they cared? And that's the psychological contradiction you have to understand. People don't always express emotional significance at the same speed that they experience it. An avoidant can appear detached while their mind is quietly recording an enormous amount of information about you. They may not respond with emotional language. They may not tell you how deeply a moment affected them, but the memory can remain. Why? Because attention is one of the foundations of attachment. We remember what matters to us. Think about your own life. You don't remember every conversation you've ever had. You don't remember every face you've passed or every sentence someone has spoken to you. Your mind filters constantly. It stores what it considers emotionally meaningful, relevant, surprising, or important. So when someone remembers unusually specific things about you, it can indicate that you occupied more psychological space than they openly acknowledged. But again, let's maintain intellectual honesty. Remembering details does not automatically mean someone wants a relationship. Memory alone isn't proof of commitment. What matters is the pattern. Do they remember what makes you uncomfortable? Do they remember what makes you happy? Do they remember the boundaries you expressed? Do they remember conversations that required vulnerability? Do they notice subtle changes in your behavior? Those details tell you something different. Because now they're not simply remembering facts, they're remembering you. And that distinction matters. An avoidant may intellectually tell themselves, this isn't serious, I don't need this, I can walk away. But emotional memory doesn't always obey intellectual declarations. The mind stores experiences according to emotional significance, not merely according to what we consciously decide should matter. This is why someone can move physically away from you and still encounter you psychologically. A place reminds them of you. A certain song brings back a conversation. A familiar phrase suddenly has your voice attached to it. A routine feels different because you used to be part of it. They aren't necessarily choosing to remember. The memory simply arrives. And that is one of the quietest forms of emotional attachment. You become associated with experiences. You become part of their internal landscape. But here's where I want you to be careful. Don't turn yourself into a detective. Don't analyze every remembered detail as evidence that someone is secretly obsessed with you. That's another form of emotional dependence. If you spend your days decoding their behavior, you're still giving them control over your attention. Instead, recognize the larger principle. Your value is not determined by whether someone admits that you mattered. Your value existed before they recognized it. That's a philosophical truth worth remembering. You don't become valuable because someone remembers your favorite song. You don't become worthy because someone misses your laugh. You don't become significant because an avoidant suddenly realizes they remember everything about you. You were already significant. Their memory simply reveals what their conscious behavior may have concealed. And sometimes that realization arrives after distance. When you're together, people can become accustomed to the experience of you. When you're gone, the mind begins reconstructing what was lost through memory. The ordinary becomes meaningful because it is no longer ordinary. That is why the smallest details can become unexpectedly powerful. The coffee order, the inside joke, the late night conversation, the way you listened without interrupting, the moment you made them feel safe enough to reveal something they rarely shared. Those experiences can remain long after the relationship becomes quiet. And if an avoidant has genuinely formed an attachment, those memories can become difficult to dismiss because they represent something their defenses cannot completely control. But your lesson isn't to wait for them to remember. Your lesson is to remember yourself. Remember what you deserve. Remember the boundaries you once compromised. Remember how much energy you spent trying to convince someone of your value. And remember this, the right relationship will not require you to disappear before someone notices you. You should never have to become a memory before someone realizes your value. And when all of these signs begin to converge, the future they quietly imagined, the weight of your absence, the awareness that you have choices, the memories they cannot simply erase, eventually the avoidant can arrive at the most uncomfortable question of all. What if I actually lose this person? That question changes the emotional equation because there is a tremendous difference between believing someone is available and realizing they are no longer guaranteed. For a person who has spent years protecting themselves through emotional distance, attachment can feel manageable as long as they believe they remain in control. They can come close, retreat, analyze, rationalize, and create space whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable. But eventually, reality challenges that strategy. You can only keep someone at a distance for so long before the distance itself becomes the reason you lose them. And that's where the internal conflict becomes profound. One part of them may still want independence. Another part has begun recognizing the emotional value of connection. One part says, I need space. Another quietly asks, but what happens if they stop waiting for me? That isn't necessarily a conscious conversation happening in their head. Human psychology is much more subtle than that. Sometimes the realization appears through anxiety, memories, curiosity, regret, or a sudden awareness of how different life feels without the person. They may begin thinking about the moments they dismissed. They may reconsider conversations they once avoided. They may recognize that what they called pressure was sometimes simply another person's legitimate desire for clarity. They may begin seeing that the relationship didn't disappear because you demanded too much. It disappeared because they kept creating distance without considering the cost. And that realization can be painful, but pain can be informative. It can show us the consequences of our patterns. That's why the fear of losing someone can become a turning point. Not because fear automatically creates healthy love, but because consequences force awareness. When there are no consequences, patterns can continue indefinitely. When consequences become real, a person has to decide whether the pattern is still worth protecting. This is where the avoidant faces a philosophical choice. Do I protect myself from vulnerability at all costs? Or do I accept that meaningful connection always requires some degree of vulnerability? Because you cannot have profound intimacy without risk. You cannot be deeply known and completely protected at the same time. You cannot experience genuine closeness while maintaining total emotional control. At some point, you have to surrender the illusion that you can guarantee safety by keeping everyone at arm's length. And this is not just an avoidant lesson, it's a human lesson. Every meaningful relationship requires courage. But here's what I want you to understand. It is not your responsibility to teach someone that lesson by sacrificing yourself. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot become patient enough to eliminate their fear. You cannot communicate perfectly enough to make them abandon every defense. And you certainly cannot build a healthy relationship by constantly proving that you will tolerate being neglected. Your responsibility is different. Your responsibility is to remain aligned with yourself. If they return, let their actions speak. If they communicate, listen. If they take accountability, observe whether the change is consistent. If they want connection, allow them to participate in creating it. But don't confuse someone's fear of losing you with their ability to love you well. Those are two different things. Someone can fear losing you and still lack the emotional skills required for a healthy relationship. Someone can miss you and still repeat the same destructive pattern. Someone can realize your value and still refuse to change. That is why your standard must remain higher than their realization. The ultimate goal isn't to make the avoidant panic. The goal is to reach a place where you no longer need their panic to validate your importance. Because once you understand your own worth, something extraordinary happens. You stop asking, will they finally choose me? You start asking, Are they capable of meeting me where I am? That question puts responsibility where it belongs. You don't need to chase. You don't need to convince. You don't need to manipulate. You don't need to become smaller so someone else can feel safe. You simply stand in your truth and allow reality to reveal itself. If they have genuinely claimed you in their mind, their next challenge is not recognizing your value. It is developing the courage to act consistently with that recognition. And if they cannot do that, you still haven't lost. Because your greatest victory was never getting someone to fear losing you. It was becoming someone who refuses to lose themselves. Let them confront the possibility of losing you, but never lose yourself trying to make them stay. So when you step back and look at the entire picture, you begin to understand that the quiet signs are rarely about dramatic declarations. They are about psychological shifts, the way someone begins to remember you, imagine you in their future, feel your absence, recognize your independence, and eventually confront the possibility of losing access to you. But here's the most important part. Don't build your life around decoding those signs, because your power doesn't come from knowing whether an avoidant has claimed you in their mind. Your power comes from knowing that you have already claimed yourself. You don't need someone to secretly miss you to prove that you mattered. You don't need them to regret losing you to validate your worth. You don't need them to come back before you can move forward. If they truly value you, let that value become visible through their actions. Let them communicate. Let them become accountable. Let them demonstrate consistency. Let them show you that what they feel internally can become something healthy externally. And if they don't, you keep walking, because love should never require you to abandon your dignity just to remain connected to someone. Maybe they will eventually realize what you meant to them. Maybe they will recognize that the person they kept at a distance became the person they could not easily forget. Maybe they will finally understand that their greatest fear was never intimacy itself. It was the possibility of losing someone who made intimacy feel real. But your life cannot be placed on hold while they figure that out. You have your own future to build, your own identity to strengthen, your own peace to protect. And that's the paradox. The moment you stop needing someone to choose you is often the moment you become most powerful. Not because you became cold, not because you became ruthless, not because you learned how to manipulate someone's emotions. You became powerful because you learned the difference between loving someone and losing yourself for them. So if an avoidant has quietly claimed you in their mind, let them confront that truth in their own time. Let them wrestle with their fears. Let them decide whether they are willing to turn internal feelings into external action. You don't have to chase the answer. Your responsibility is to keep becoming the person you were meant to become, because the deepest form of emotional strength is not making someone afraid to lose you. It is becoming so secure in your own worth that whether they stay or leave, you refuse to leave yourself. And remember this, you don't need to be chosen by someone who is still running from themselves. Choose yourself and let everything else reveal what it truly is.